Hello, my name is Ed Tick. I am Director of Soldier's Heart, a nonprofit organization supporting veterans' healing and safe return all over the United States and in fact all around the world. I'm the author of many books on veterans' concerns, especially war and the soul. I teach that the wounds of war are actually spiritual wounds, soul wounds, and wounds to our entire community. They can't be understood merely as stress and anxiety disorders, but are in fact holistic disorders affecting every aspect of our being that we attribute to the soul. And, of course, spread through the generations. They are intergenerational wounds, they are trans-species wounds, they are wounds to the entire planet. I've been working with veterans for over 30 years. I'm not a veteran myself, but I myself, of course, am affected by the wounds of war, of my generation and of my family history. I inherited the wounds of war and know them personally. My grandmother escaped the Russian pogroms at age 14. My grandfather fled the Polish army during World War I because Jews did not live through the Polish army during World War I. My uncle was a medic at the Battle of the Bulge and was missing behind enemy lines for over 2 months. He came home from World War II with the worst case of walking post-traumatic stress disorder I've ever seen in my life and my career. My mother, at 85, still grieves the only brother she lost in soul, in spirit, in mind during World War II. His body came home, but the rest of him stayed far away. So my family has inherited the intergenerational wounds, and of course, never understood it, never talked about it, never opened with these stories until I, after many, many years of working with veterans and their families, went home and demanded that this family tell their stories and open their hearts to what really happened to us and how it's affected us over the generations. By now I've worked with thousands of veterans and their family members, and I have seen the intergenerational effects in so many ways. My generation, the baby boomers, the Vietnam generation, were raised by the World War II generation, and most of the people of my generation, both men and women, mourn what happened to our fathers. The fathers who were in World War II and of that generation all went silent. Their hearts went numb, their voices were lost. They tried to be good fathers in the sense of providing for the family, but we all, my entire generation, has a father wound, a missing father wound. They could not be intimate. That generation was ravaged with an epidemic of alcoholism. Many people had nightmares and explosive rages, such as we see in post-traumatic stress disorder victims of all ages and all wars, but they never talked about it. And many of us, including myself, my father was an MP at the end of the World War II era. We were victimized by the rages, physical violence, and silence and distance of our fathers. So we've all inherited these wounds. And of course I've treated them for decades in every generation. The most telling story that I can share with you in this brief time about the intergenerational wounds are how they are passed on psychically and unconsciously, even when the children don't know the stories of their parents. So here's a few vivid examples. One couple came to consult with me. A Vietnam combat veteran and his wife came at the beginning of the first Gulf War because their son had just turned 18, and the son was terrified that he was going to be drafted like his father was and have to serve in combat. Well, the parents came to consult with me because in the son's terror that he would have to go to war, he began manifesting many post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, especially sleep disorders and nightmares. He was having very vivid and intense nightmares of being in combat, and the parents were quite worried. Not only because he was having these combat nightmares, they understood that, but the combat nightmares were the exact stories that his father had lived in Vietnam. The only difference was that the son was in the father's place. The astonishing thing was that The father had never told his son his stories. He had been in therapy and had told the therapist the stories, and he was doing fairly well, pretty well adjusted and healed from his PTSD, but he protected his family from those stories. And even though he never told his own son his stories, the son knew them somehow, down to the last detail. The son had unconsciously or psychically absorbed and inherited the father's stories and was reliving them as his own, even though he had never heard them. That's one aspect of how the traumatic wounding of war is passed on through the generations. Another vivid one comes from Vietnam, where I lead healing journeys to Vietnam every year, and I have worked with Vietnamese young people who were born after the American war in Vietnam, who never witnessed any of the horrors of battle or the atrocities of warfare. And even just a few weeks ago, when I was in Vietnam, I was working with a wonderful young Vietnamese woman from the north named Ngoc, 23 years old, who was having nightmares of the My Lai massacre. She didn't have any family there. Her family was from the north. They didn't lose any people in the war, but she's had enough exposure to My Lai through history lessons, through photography, through old newspaper reports, that she knows enough about it, but her nightmares were quite vivid. She saw elderly men being abused and battered unto death by American GIs. She didn't know where these nightmares came from. They weren't passed on personally, they were passed on collectively. And the Vietnamese teach that when a soul dies by violence, that soul is wandering and stuck between the worlds and can enter into and visit the living. And Ngoc believes, and as Vietnamese do, that the souls of some of the restless wandering spirits from the My Lai massacre and others may have entered her and visited her in her sleep and are calling for rest. So these are just vivid examples of the way trauma is passed through the generations. They're also passed through the species around the planet. We know that many animal species by now have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and even animal species will break down in the same characteristic ways. Their social order breaks down, they no longer behave as herds or flocks, they start to fight for individuality. Parents will abuse their children, elephant parents abusing elephant children, or elephants having sexual activity with rhinoceri. These things have never been observed in nature before, and they are characteristic of the same breakdown when violence is done to an environment such that everybody feels their life threatened and their environment taken apart and feels that there's no refuge. Every species, not just human beings, will break down in this way. So across species and through the generations, war trauma affects and impacts us all to the most horrible extent. Nobody escapes. Generation after generation inherits it. And the last thing I would like to say is that this has been going on for 5,000 years. We know of 14,600 wars recorded in history in the last 5,000 years. That's 3 wars a year for 5,000 years. America itself has had over 50 wars since our founding in 1775. Except for the Great Depression was our longest period of peace. And except for that, we never had more than 4.5 years without war. So we haven't even raised a generation in peace. We don't know what peace is. We must realize this. We must realize, just as the Native Americans teach, that we have to think of the 7th generation, and we have to heal our shared wounds, our collective wounds from war and violent trauma, and make the world safe, and finally raise a generation in peace so the nightmares go away and we realize we are all in this one beautiful world together.